We have entered fully the season of Pentecost, with last week being Trinitarian or Trinity Sunday, and the week before being Pentecost, the week before that being Ascension, the weeks before that were Easter, and then Easter Sunday, and go on and on. Honestly, from the beginning of Advent straight through to Trinity Sunday, maybe Pentecost, it is nonstop. And we are looking at the feasts of the church year, the seasons of the church year, trying to make all the scripture work. And now we're in the season of Pentecost. And this is a time where we can breathe and relax and delve a little deeper into some of the scriptures we will missed because we were rushing through to get to the next season. And if you're a bit of a romantic like I am, maybe in the distance you hear little Gershwin singing "Summertime" and "The Livin' Is Easy." Because I want you to have that kind of a theme and energy as we're entering this. This is a time of deeper reflection where we're not having to make the next big season happen. This is our long stretch. For those of you in churches that recognize the liturgical colors, this is the beginning of the green stretch that seems to go on forever and ever, certainly for months. And we're back in Matthew. And we'll spend the majority of the season back in Matthew. There might be the occasional, I haven't looked ahead, so there might be the occasional story from John pops up, but generally we're in Matthew. And Matthew, as you remember, is recognized as being the most beautiful scripture. It's certainly the longest scripture. That's why it's first. There was an assumption once upon a time that if something was long, then it was original, and the shorter stuff came later. We now know that that's not the case, that short stuff can be earlier and be added to make it look longer. So we know Matthew is early. We know Matthew is talking to a group of Hebrew people, probably in northern Syria, who are desperate to be reminded of why all of this matters, because they are losing their sense of connection, sense of purpose, sense of reason to be followers of Christ. This is after the end of the temple. This is after the diaspora. A lot of the original generations of Jesus will have moved on by this point in time. There may be some that met him in their congregation, but not necessarily. So the person writing this, or the people writing this, are trying to encourage those listening that there really is something to this. There really is a point to everything that we're talking about. Every story of Jesus, every healing we hear about, every call to action, every promise to remember, and they are just wanting to feel that connection. So that's where we start on this lazy Sunday as we start off Pentecost. And we're given a couple of stories here. One that they could normally be taken as two different ones. One is the calling of Matthew, who was known to be a tax collector. And then we get the story that in Luke we know is a man from the temple named Jairus. We don't know who that is. In Matthew's gospel, it wasn't recorded. But the two stories are kind of woven together with a third, and that's the woman with the hemorrhage. And as I was going over these stories, a theme actually that just kind of jumped out at me, I hadn't thought about too much before, was just exhaustion, which must have fit with those people who were listening to this for the first time, who were trying to find some identity, find some purpose and reason for remaining when all the pagans around them had long been telling them that it wasn't worth the effort. So we have three people here. A tax collector who must have been exhausted being a social outcast. He would have been a Hebrew person working for the Roman government. So he would have been shunned. He would have been essentially not included in anything, and his entire family would have that kind of treatment from society, because your family was everything in those days. That was your entire social cachet. So to have a member be essentially someone who's conspiring with the enemy was not going to get you any favors. So socially, he must have been exhausted. And then we have a woman hemorrhaging from blood. Now, it's all nice and neatened up and whatnot, but essentially, this is a woman who has probably been experiencing menstrual blood and leaking for a very, very long time. And any woman in your life, or you women yourselves, know this, it's exhausting. I mean, I can't even imagine she had any iron left in her system after that constant letdown of blood. She would have been physically exhausted. And because of the blood taboo in this society, she would have been emotionally exhausted, socially exhausted. Much like Matthew, she'd be ostracized. And then we get to the person who works in the temple. Now, the temple was notoriously a place that tried to argue against everything Jesus did. All of Jesus' actions, all of Jesus' miracles, all of Jesus' teachings, everything. That seemed to be a focus for those in the temple. And here we have this person who works at the temple, breaching all of that for love of his daughter. And he wants her to live. So he goes in search of Jesus. He must have been socially exhausted, much like Matthew. He would have just set up a place where he probably could be an outcast at this point in time. And the love of a father, that he would tear apart his relationship with the ultimate institution in Hebrew society, turn his back on his peers who have been criticizing, he might even have been criticizing himself, the actions of Jesus. And suddenly he is so desperate that he's going to turn his back on all of that and go find Jesus for the help of his child. 3 exhausted, physically, emotionally, mentally exhausted people. I came across this question on Facebook just the other day. What is the point of saying Jesus is a child of God if we're all a child of God? Like, what was the point of Jesus? It's a good question. I know this guy. He was just kind of stirring the pot. He wasn't actually asking a real question. Because if he had been asking a real question, he actually would have asked me personally, because he values my perspective. But it's a good question to have out there in the public forum regardless. Why is Jesus important? Why do we even bother? Why do we pay attention? And then we have stories like these 3 humans that are basically being in the process of being shunned or have been shunned from their communities, all seeking out Jesus. Because this is not just a story of exhaustion. This is also the story of faith and hope. Matthew, the tax collector, followed Jesus and shared with him the way other sinners did, it tells us in Scripture, because they had hope and they had faith in Jesus and the message he brought. The woman with the hemorrhage, she was so full of faith, she completely believed. She didn't even have to interact with him, which would have been a major social faux pas. I mean, men and women did talk, but a woman who was under a blood taboo, she wouldn't have gone anywhere near a man. But she did. And all she wanted to do was touch his cloak. That was it. She had so much faith that even just touching his cloak would be enough to heal her. And then we have Jairus. Well, the man we're assuming is Jairus, who turned his back on his entire income, his social structure, his standing, and in his hope and his faith, and more than a little desperation, he went to Jesus and begged that he would come take care of his daughter. All of these are examples that we can follow. These are real people who were brought to real moments of despair, who had nothing else, and they reached out to the promise they were given by Jesus that the world could be different, that they would not always be on the outside, they would not always be suffering, they would not always be part of a group of people who just condemned without really engaging. As we're going through the Scripture, as we're going through Matthew, these stories will continue emerging. The reason we have Jesus, or had him living among us, was to teach us something about how God cared for us. It's grand to have all these theories, but here was actual physical engagement that mattered. And Jesus doing what Jesus did, which basically was to say social convention had no sway. A woman who was bleeding, who no one would go near. And Jesus was okay with it. A man who was a collaborator with the government, who also was part of meals where there were prostitutes and there were others who were not acceptable to polite Hebrew excuse me, society. Didn't matter. Jesus was there for them. A man who had all the standing in the world, tossing it aside for love. And Jesus was there for him. Why do we have Jesus? Because Jesus showed us how to be with people, how to love them, how to respond to hope, how to respond to desperation, how to respond to being ostracized, how to show that we were all loved by God. How do we take those lessons now and apply them to ourselves and our own community? That's our challenge for this week and going forward. Where do we see our need, our hope, our desperation, our ostracism? I don't know if that's a word. How do we relate to Jesus? Where are we in that relationship? Are we ready to turn away from social convention and go to what we need and we know we need for ourselves and our family? Are we ready to have that hope and reach out to touch or to talk or to share a meal? Doesn't matter. Jesus will decide how we engage each other. All we have to do is have the hope and the bravery to reach out and say, Jesus, I need you. Please help. Once we do that, we're into a whole new other world of amazing experiences. And that was the promise that Jesus brought. For each of these characters, each of these people, their lives were transformed. That's why we have Jesus, as this power to become new people, filled with hope, filled with promise, and filled with tomorrows where we can share that message with others.